So, looking at chapter 5 now. So obviously it's about the complexity of psychological development. So we look at all the different mental theories and ways in which we differ. Okay, so the first thing that we're looking at now is what is development? So basically, how is development defined? Development is the changes that take place throughout a person's lifespan, usually starting from birth and ending at old age, or ending at death, in other words. These changes have to be relatively permanent or lasting in order to be considered as developmental changes. So for example, once you have your growth spurt in your early teenage years, you're not going to go back and shrink to the short person that you were in primary school. Okay, you are going to remain at that height. So that change is relatively permanent or lasting. Development, obviously, when we study development in psychology, we don't just look at the physiological development or the bodily development, because, you know, we're looking at the mind as well. Okay, how does the mind develop? How does a person's personality develop? All of those things are important for us in psychology, because psychology is not just a study about the body or the brain. It's also a study about how a person carries themselves socially or mentally or cognitively. Okay, so that's what that's how development in psychology is a little bit different from development in other subjects, for example, such as biology or even health and human. Okay, now studying development does give an insight as well into how a person's thoughts, feelings, and behaviors change as they get older. Now, the areas of development that we looked at, so there were emotional, social, physical, and cognitive. And we use the memory tip PECS to remember them. So PECS to remember the 4 areas of development. So PECS, that's a memory tip that we used. Okay, so physical, emotional, cognitive, and social. So just remember that. So you need to know what the definitions of these 4 areas of development are. So the first one is emotional. So emotional development is basically talking about how does a person's ability to express their emotions and their feelings change as they get older, okay? And it's not just about how you express your feelings, but also how do you deal with your feelings? How do you control your feelings, okay? When you're young, like a little kid, you can't really control your anger or your frustration or your sadness. You just cry. But as you get older, you're much better to express, you know, you show your expression of sadness in a much more subtle way. So you could pretend to be happy even though you're kind of sad or upset on the inside. So that's basically how emotional development can change as we get older. The next thing we look at is, and these are just some examples. You don't need to know this table in depth. It's just showing you how, for example, in the early stages of life, how emotional development can occur. So a child that's in kindergarten might go from, trying to physically hurt other people or physically fight with other people, understanding that I can hurt someone's feelings in this way, to actually understanding that it's actually more effective to tease someone, to make fun of them, and that can actually hurt their feelings more. Okay, so that's basically showing you the emotional development. The next thing that we look at is social development. So social development is, again, whenever we think about social concepts, we always think about, for example, relationships, okay? How your relationships with other people grow, how your interactions, your ability to interact and communicate with other people actually gets more matured or developed as well. And as you get older, obviously your social skills develop. You are able to make connections with more and more people. You're able to branch out and form more interactions with a wide range of people compared to just the people you were interacting with in maybe primary school or kindergarten. Okay, so you're able to have a more sophisticated kind of social development and expression of social behaviors there. Physical development. So physical development is all the changes that occur in the body and its systems, which indicate that a person is getting older or they are maturing. Okay, so obviously it's kind of like referring to all those physical changes like growth spurts, the growth of the brain, how your muscles and your bones and your hard skeleton is basically developing. Okay, all the hormonal changes that precede puberty, all that kind of stuff comes under your physical development, all to do with the body and the bodily systems. And the last one we look at is cognitive development. So cognitive development is basically referring to a change in a person's mental abilities. So their ability to think, plan, make decisions, use language, okay, learn new things. All of that is to do with cognitive development. And if you remember, we actually looked at cognitive development in Piaget's theory of cognitive development, okay, and he talked about how at different ages we are able to demonstrate specific cognitive skills. Now, in the earlier part of Unit 1, when we were learning about the lobes, we understood that the frontal lobe does have a role in many cognitive functions. And like we said, your frontal lobe doesn't fully mature until you are 25 years of age. So until then, your frontal lobe is actually continuing to mature and continuing to grow. Okay, and obviously this indicates that as we get older, our cognition, our ability to think, reason, make decisions, plan, problem solve, actually becomes more and more sophisticated and advanced. Okay, so that's cognitive development. Okay, so now we're looking at some of the theories or concepts or ways in which psychologists try to understand how psychological development actually proceeds as we get older. So these are just the 4 perspectives that they have, essentially. So the first one is continuous versus discontinuous development. So some psychologists or developmental theorists, they view development as being like a ramp where there are no sudden changes. It's just a nice continuous kind of trajectory that they're kind of traveling on there. There's no sudden changes. And as you grow, you barely notice the changes that occur. It's not like sudden steps or sudden jumps that you are going through. It's just simply a straight line. Okay, that's called the continuous perspective. Now, the discontinuous perspective is a little bit different. The discontinuous perspective suggests that when people develop, we actually develop through a number of clear steps and clear changes. And we can even refer to these as shifts in development, okay? And that it's very obvious when a child is developing through a discontinuous kind of perspective of development, because you can see that, okay, they learn to crawl, they learn to walk, they learn to read, they learn to write, they learn to do complex maths problems, they learn to debate a certain idea. Okay, so you can see that obviously the development is a lot more discontinuous. It's a lot more broken down into clear steps. A lot of the theories that we look at in this chapter do follow the discontinuous perspective, suggesting that at each stage of your life, you are going through a number of steps or a number of changes, and that we can clearly separate one change from the other. It's not just all one continuous blur. Okay, so that's basically your continuous versus discontinuous development. Sequential nature of development suggests that as we are growing up and as we're getting older, there's a specific order or a specific sequence through which we follow development. So for example, we don't grow up being able to, show the skill of public speaking. We can barely talk when we're babies, okay? We can only like mutter a few syllables here and there, a few nonsense words. As you get older and you start to learn language, you can then use language to present elaborate speeches, to participate in debating, to do moving and inspirational public speeches, okay, or public speaking. So that's showing you the sequential nature of development, that everyone, no matter how oratory they are, no matter how good they are with speaking or language, everyone grew up, or everyone was born just like babbling, like baby language, okay? And eventually, as they went through the experiences in their life, they were able to build up that complexity or build up that sophistication in the skill of language, or in any skill for that matter. Okay, so that's talking about the sequential nature of development, that development doesn't just occur randomly. There is an orderly sequence through which almost all humans will show particular skills, such as language, for example. The next one is individual differences in development. So this is a perspective that suggests that most psychologists or developmental theorists believe that even if two individuals are very similar, or they grow up in the same household, the individual development can still be different, okay? Because even if you grow up in the same house, you and your sibling, for example, might have different friend groups. You might have different experiences outside of home, okay, like at school or with your friends or with any other extracurricular stuff you do, okay? You might have different life events, okay? If your pet passed away and your siblings never really cared for your pet, that's going to be a life event that affects you differently or impacts you in a different way than it does the rest of your family. Okay, so individual differences in development are important because we need to acknowledge that no two people are the same. We all go through different experiences. We all have different backgrounds that we bring. So essentially, because of this, people can also develop differently or at different rates. Now, when we talk about physical development, this is more genetically predetermined. So for example, if your mother or father is quite tall, there will be a very good chance that you are also going to grow to be tall, okay? Obviously, if there are factors that support that, like you have good nutrition during your childhood, you don't have any other medical related conditions that stunt your growth, you will grow to your peak optimal height. Okay, and we learned more about this when we talked about the interaction between nature versus nurture. So we'll go through that a little bit in a few more slides. Okay, now, obviously, even though we all develop at different rates, there are certain norms, okay? There are certain standards. So for example, if you're a student in grade prep and you still can't speak, that's probably an indication that there's something abnormal at play, or there's some kind of medical condition that was unaccounted for. Because by the age of 5, you should be able to speak quite fluently using proper language, and you should be ready for school. So if you still haven't shown any indication of language development by then that indicates that there is some abnormal progression of development there. The next thing we're looking at, or the last perspective we're looking at here, is the quantitative and qualitative changes. So developmental theorists believed that as we get older and we develop in all the different ways, like physically, emotionally, cognitively, and socially, we go through both quantitative and qualitative changes. Now, quantitative changes, as the word suggests, are changes that we can measure in terms of a quantity or a number. So if you're 10 years old and you've got a sibling that is 4 years old, if I ask the 4-year-old how many words do you know, that 4-year-old might say, oh, I know about 40 words. Okay, and the 10-year-old might say, well, I know about 200 words or 100 words. Okay, so the older you get, the number of words that you can speak or define or know actually are going to increase in number, and you can actually count those off. Okay, and obviously if you play a great game like Scrabble or some other word related game, the older you are, the more points you're going to get, because you just simply know a higher number of words than those players who are a little bit younger. Qualitative changes are changes that are measured in terms of the quality or the type of way in which the behavior is expressed. So in other words, if I ask a 5-year-old to describe the concept of happiness, that 5-year-old might describe it as, oh, happiness is about having all the money in the world, being able to buy all the Barbies or all the, I don't know, whatever kids play with these days, I want, okay? Whereas a 30-year-old might say, well, happiness to me is about, you know, being in a job that I enjoy, or being able to provide for my family and see that all their needs are met. Okay, so it's a very different kind of perspective of happiness there. And the way you describe happiness is a qualitative change, because it's not looking at the number, it's looking at the description. Okay, so that's basically quantitative and qualitative changes. So now we're looking at nature versus nurture. Okay, now when we're talking about nature versus nurture, in your book they've been given slightly different names, but it's the same thing. Heredity is another word for nature, so I'll probably just write that down. Nature. And environment is another word for nurture. Okay, now both of these concepts, when you combine them together, they actually create what we call as the nature versus nurture debate. And that is this idea or this question that basically asks people, is it your genetics or is it your genes that actually determine what kind of a person you're going to become, or is it your environment? And so the answer to this question is that it's actually an interaction between both. So like I was telling you before, if both of your parents are tall, you are genetically predisposed to also become tall. But if you don't have proper nutrition, or you develop some kind of a health condition when you're really young that stops your growth, or you don't have release of hormones, or you have some hormonal issue that stops your growth hormone from being released properly, you might not actually grow to your full extent. So even though you're genetically predisposed to becoming tall, the environment isn't there for you to become tall. Okay, so basically it's important for us to remember that the ways in which we develop are especially focused not just on your genes, but also on your environment. Okay, and the environment can influence the expression of the gene as well. So that's basically our heredity and our environment. Heredity is basically a way of saying the genetic material that's transmitted from a biological parent to a child, And environment is basically any kind of experience or situation or event that we're exposed to, okay, during our lifetime. And this could even just be your home life or your home experiences. It could be what kind of friends you have. It could be what kind of culture you grow up with, okay? It could even be your exposure to the media. So all of these things basically influence our development. So nature versus nurture clip, we did watch that in class. You can again go through this if you want to understand the topic better. And we remember when we did this in class and I asked you guys to come up and give examples. So some of you said, yeah, how tall you'll grow is in your genetics. But yep, that's, yeah. And the other example is, yeah, developing arthritis. So it could be in your genes, but if you do have a healthy diet, you take all those proper nutrients that are required for bone growth and bone development, you might be less likely to get it, or you might not get it at all. Okay, so again, it's not just a matter of, oh, I'm doomed for life because my mom has depression, or I'm doomed for life because my dad has arthritis. It's not as clear cut as that. Okay, so the nature versus nurture debate is, again, it's not just one is more important than the other, but that both of these are an interaction, okay? They interact with one another. And there is a bidirectional relationship between the two. So there is a interaction there. It's not that one is more important than the other for any form of development. So just remember that. Okay. The next thing we're looking at is the role of maturation in development. So maturation comes from the word mature. Maturation thus means the way in which you develop in an orderly and sequential way, which means a specific order or a specific number of steps. And basically how your nervous system, how your bodily structures all basically mature and develop and become more sophisticated as a function of your genetics. Okay, now obviously when we're talking about physical development, it is very much influenced by your genes, okay? The kind of facial structure that you get, the kind of bodily structure that you get, even things like hormonal release, even things like how you respond to certain types of medication are actually influenced by your genetics. So it's important to remember that regardless of what genetics you have, there will be a certain point in time in which all children will show the same behavior. So we don't expect a child to basically come into the world crawling or walking, okay? They come into the world quite helpless, but as they obviously start to be familiarized with their environment, they will then start to think about crawling around, exploring the environment. They will then slowly start to walk, okay? They'll slowly start to use baby language. Then they'll slowly start to talk properly, okay? So all of these things operate under a principle of readiness that indicates that no matter how much you force a child to walk or to talk, or how much like of those little toys that you buy them to encourage them to walk around the house, they're not going to be able to walk until they have come to the physical and genetically programmed component of their development that basically instructs that this is the time that the child will walk. Okay, again, this is why there can be slight variations. Some children start walking a little bit earlier than other children. It's not because they're more physically skilled, it's just because genetically they are programmed to walk at that particular time. Okay, so again, this can be exemplified for not just like walking and talking, but even, for example, when certain young people reach puberty. Okay, some people reach puberty earlier than others. Some have their growth spurt, in grade 6. Some have them in year 8. Okay, so obviously it's again genetically influenced. Okay, how quick you mature, the concept or the process of maturation is dependent on your genetics. So that's important for you to remember. Okay, then we look at the sensitive and the critical periods of development. The sensitive period of development is a specific time in your development when an organism is more responsive to learning and developing particular functions, okay, given that they are exposed to relevant experiences. So what do we mean when we say that they have to be exposed to relevant experiences? Well, normally, if I am growing up and I'm in a household where I am watching adults kind of talk to each other, okay, I am basically given a basic healthy environment there, where I am fed properly, I am given shelter, I'm not mistreated, or I'm not neglected. I am going to basically be able to show functions like language. I'm going to be able to walk around. I'm going to be able to talk. I'm going to be able to do all of those things at a normal period of time, okay, in the normal time frame that is typical, okay, for children my age or for babies my age. So if I don't have those environments, for example, remember when we watched that thing about Genie, Okay, Jeannie was a girl who was locked up in her basement. Okay, she was actually locked there from when she was a newborn baby to when she was 13 years of age. She was never allowed to go outside to see the real world. It was basically one of the worst cases of neglect, okay, especially in terms of her development. So you can see that when she was actually found by social services, she could barely walk. She had a very obvious hunchback because she was just stooped in a chair in the basement the whole time. Okay, she could barely talk because it was only her in the basement. She didn't have the ability to babble, use baby language with other people around her. She didn't have the ability to look at adults and look at how adults' mouths were moving while they talk, okay? And babies use these cues to actually develop their sense of language. So for Jeannie, because she missed her sensitive period, which was the important or specific time in which she had to learn language, in which she had to learn to walk around and crawl and all of those skills, she actually came out of her house at age 13 when she was found, very abnormally developed. And you could tell this just by looking at her, that it was obvious that something was quite wrong with her development. Okay, now obviously, yeah, cases of extreme neglect show us the impact of not being exposed to those experiences that promote learning. So if you miss that sensitive period where you were supposed to learn to talk or walk, it's going to be a lot harder for you to then make up for that. And even though Jeannie was put into rehabilitation, she was put into speech therapy, she never really developed the same fluency or the same advanced language abilities as people her age, okay, at that time. So that's, again, a nice video you can watch. We did watch this in class, but if you want to watch it again, it'll probably help you to understand that topic. The critical period of development is basically a very narrow period in time. So remember, we said the critical period is different from the sensitive period because the critical period is very narrow. It's not a period of years that we're talking about here. It's a period of maybe a few minutes or maybe 1 hour, okay? Very small, very narrow period of time. And critical periods are more relevant to animals rather than humans, okay? We don't really have critical periods in humans. We have sensitive periods, but critical periods are more relevant for animals. And if you remember, we did watch a video about the process of imprinting. Okay, imprinting is when baby goslings, or goslings are baby geese, what they do is as soon as they're born, they look around and the first moving object that they see, they believe that that's their mother. And so they imprint on that particular. In this example here, the ducks have kind of imprinted on this lady who's kind of walking around them, and they believe that this is her, this is their mother, okay? So that's just one example. So a critical period, because the ducks only have a matter of a few minutes, maybe 1 to 2 minutes to actually latch onto a moving object and decide that, yep, this is our mother, this is a critical period, very narrow compared to a sensitive period, okay? Sensitive period can take place over a number of years, okay? We do have a number of years for us to be able to learn how to walk or talk. Critical periods are a lot more narrow and a lot shorter in time duration. And there's the video that I was talking about. So you can watch that again if you want to. So then we looked at twin studies. So basically looking at the difference between identical and non-identical twins. So we basically talked about the fact that identical twins, even though they have identical kind of genetic material or DNA, they might not always grow up to be the same person. In some cases, especially when parents have identical twins, they dress them up the same, they make them go to the same school. But if you see certain twins who, for example, are identical twins, but then they've got their own set of friends, they've got their own set of things they like to do, they have different hobbies, even though the nature is the same for them, the genetic material is the same, the nurture or the environmental experiences that each of those twins go through will be different. And so they will end up developing quite differently. Okay, obviously there are different cases to this. For example, remember I gave you the example of these two boys who were given the same amount of tutoring, they were given the same kinds of extracurricular activities, and they actually ended up getting the exact same ATAR at the end of their year 12, which is kind of scary if you think about it. But yeah, it really depends on, do they have the same environment? If they have the same environment, identical twins might actually grow up in very similar ways. But again, as identical twins get older and as they form their own identity, it's very unlikely that they will be a clone of each other. They'll kind of go their separate ways and do their own things. Okay, so identical twins, remember, have the same genetic material. but we can't say that their environmental experiences will necessarily be the same, especially if twin 1 wants to do engineering in university, twin 2 wants to do creative arts or something. They're obviously going to go through 2 different pathways there. Okay, so obviously our experiences might be different. Now, fraternal twins are known as dizygotic. Dizygotic means that they're fertilized by 2 different sperm cells. So basically, with dizygotic twins or fraternal twins, we call them non-identical because they don't look the same, and they only share about half of the genetic material or DNA. So they don't share 100%. So if you know Scarlett Johansson, you might not know that she has a non-identical twin who obviously doesn't look like her. Like, you wouldn't be able to say that they're siblings. You might just look at this picture and think, oh, that's her boyfriend or that's her partner, okay? Because they don't look the same. And in most cases, fraternal twins don't look like identical twins, okay? They don't look identical. They don't look like, you know, any other thing other than siblings maybe. All right, so fraternal twins are important because obviously fraternal twins have 50% of genetic material, which is the same, but they are kind of, you know, they do grow up in the same environment as well. So it gives us a better idea of understanding this nature versus nurture debate, okay? Because obviously it gives us a basis of comparison to compare against identical twins and to study both of them and see are the same characteristics shown, like intelligence, for example, how is that showing up in fraternal twins as compared to how it shows up in identical twins. Okay. This is just a visual example of basically, you know, you've got 2 identical twins and how the nurture, even though the nature is the same, they've got the same genes that absorb fats twice as fast as an average person, for them. So obviously how it changes in terms of the nurture. So if you've got a healthy experience there, so Jennifer's eating healthy low-fat food, Karen eats unhealthy food, even though they both are supposed to have genetics that make them gain weight twice as fast. Jennifer's obesity genes are not triggered, whereas Karen's obesity genes are, because of her experiences, because of her nurture. Okay, so again, this is talking about the interaction between nature versus nurture. And some nice videos there that you can watch about identical twin studies and nature versus nurture, which we did watch in class. Okay, so just to finish off for today, we're looking at adoption studies. So adoption studies are basically used to determine the role of nurture or environmental factors in an individual's development. So remember, with adoption studies, the adoptive parents do not share any genetic material with the kids. So when Brad Pitt and Angelina Jolie adopted, I don't even know their names. Actually, maybe I do. I think Zara, Maddox, yeah, Pax, one of them. Okay, so when they adopted these kids, you know, they didn't share genetic material, okay? Zara didn't have Angelina Jolie's genetic, you know, link for, you know, big lips. Or, you know, this boy didn't have Brad Pitt's genetics for height, okay? They didn't share the genetic material, but because they grow up with the Pitt-Jolie family, basically what happens is that they grow up very differently from a normal child, okay? They might be given maybe more resources. They might be given more opportunities, okay, which may not be shared by maybe other children of their same age. So adoption studies are important because they give us an idea of the impact of nurture or environmental factors and experiences in an individual's development, okay? And it's important for you to remember that in some traits like intelligence, just because Zara was adopted by Angelina Jolie and Brad Pitt, it doesn't mean that she'll automatically take on their intelligence or their IQ levels, okay? Because an adoptive parent, like we said, has no genetic influence on traits like intelligence, on traits like height. They can obviously support those traits by giving these kids good nutrition and by making sure they're not deficient in nutrients, but the genetic link isn't there, okay? So it gives us an idea of the impact of experience on how these children will develop and grow. Alrighty. So then we looked at attachment. So attachment is the emotional bond which occurs between an infant and another person. In other words, it's important for you to remember that infants do form attachments with anyone who cares for them, and it doesn't necessarily have to be the mother, okay? And we did talk about that in class. Now it is 10:40, I just realized. So what you'll have to do now is you'll have to go through these slides yourself. So how attachment progresses, and the different types of attachment there, okay? And I think other than that, yeah, and the factors influencing attachment. So if you finish the attachment topic yourself, all the other recordings for everything else will be on the actual drive, okay? And I'll post a link to the drive where you can access all those recordings, probably sometime later today. Okay, so that's basically done for today. So just go through attachment yourself. If there's still any questions that you're struggling with, you can again just ask me any questions you have about the topic. Okay, so I'm just going to stop the recording here. And